this theme that we've been trying to grapple with for the last few weeks of why social democracy lasted for such a brief number of decades. One of the things that the 60s does then is stand in an ambivalent relationship to the 1960s. It's both to social democracy. It's both a critique of social democracy and of the sort of paternalism of welfare capitalism, and it's an attempt to extend the radical potential of social democracy. Okay? So it twists and turns in different types of ways, and the different elements of it, I think, have a different relationship to social democracy. A key part of it, though, and probably in some ways the most influential element of it, was its critique of paternalism. Okay? Now, I've been talking to you in the last few weeks about the way in which the creation of social democracy was not a democratic revolution. It wasn't a democratic process so much as a technocratic one. Okay? And that implied a good deal of paternalism. That is to say that technocratic experts told people how the world should be organized and how people should live their lives. And if you remember, that was part of the conservative critique of the welfare state, that there were too many people telling, the state was basically telling people how to behave. And of course, part of that paternalism was built into the very structure of the state. And the very best example of that is, of course, the family, the continuing hold of the family in the subordination of women and children. And one of the key things that we're going to see today is the way in which the family itself, once a central hallmark, not just of liberalism in the 19th century, but of the welfare state in the middle of the 20th century, how the family itself becomes a target of critique and of attack, both by young people and by women. One of the things that the 60s does, which is a fundamental challenge to social democracy, is to politicize culture. Social democracy had been based around a sort of leftist analysis, a liberal left analysis of the materialist nature of politics. Okay? That politics was rooted in material conditions. Okay? And one of the things that the 60s does is try and turn that round and say that culture is the ground of politics. We saw this a little in my account of how class itself changes and becomes just another type of cultural identity, and I'm going to push that theme a little further today too. So culture becomes the new ground for a set of alternative experiments in ways of living and ways of doing politics that look fundamentally new and different, and were associated obviously with feminism, with gay and lesbian politics, with youth youth culture. Now, one of the other issues that we're going to try and work out today is whether this turn to culture, whether this turn to culture as the ground of a new type of identity politics was aimed at a type of social transformation. Actually, that is to think of society as one big thing that you can change, or whether it became increasingly geared for a quest for individual, personal emancipation. Okay? And this is a central issue for the relationship of the 60s to social democracy. Social democracy was all about transforming society as a system, doing it en masse, in big scale. And there were some elements of the 60s that try and engage in that type of analysis and mobilization. But there's many other elements that becoming increasingly associated with personal emancipation. I forgot my water bottle today, and I had an email from someone last week saying that can't possibly be you doing the podcast. You sound very old. And are you drinking tea throughout the lecture? And I said, no, I'm both very young, and I drink water, but today I'm not going to drink water. So I'm going to play you lots of clips today, and I'm going to run out of the door to the water fountain. But the clips were planned. I'm not just trying to get to the water fountain. So let's start with this question of the end of deference. Okay, so we saw elements of this. Again, one of the big themes here is the way in which the 60s doesn't begin in 1960. So part of this critique of the old paternalism, of the old deference of people towards authority, clearly began in the phenomena of the angry young men that we saw so beautifully reincarnated by Albert Finney in Saturday night, Sunday morning. Another key issue here, however, was that the long reach of the Anglican Church, which had been such a pillar of Victorian society in the 19th century, was beginning to erode. And we've seen this as a frequent lament. Remember the 1851 census, they get very alarmed about the way in which the urban working class aren't going to church. But what happens is that people continue to see that don't necessarily go to church every Sunday, or indeed any Sunday, but they would make sure that their children were baptized in a church, and they would tend to get married in a church. Okay? And it's in the 1960s that the historian Callum Brown has suggested you see the end of this dominance by the church. So here you have some figures of the declining percentage of people getting married in church between 1962 and 1997. And actually, the figure in 1970 is 60%. So 10% less people get married in church at the end of the decade than they were in 1962. And the same is true of baptism, which declines obviously quite precipitously between 56 and 81. The figure in 1970 that I didn't put up is 46%. So again, something is definitely shifting actually in the decade of the 1960s. Katie's trying to compete for the best sneeze of the semester, but pathetic attempt. There's no way this is going to compete with who we know is going to win that award. Part of this erosion of the church as the central compass of people's rites of passage in their life was its declining sense of it as providing the moral compass for society. Okay? And many people would suggest that it's in the 1960s that you have the end of a moral code based around the Anglican Church that was set in place in all the big reforms of the first half of the 19th century. So in 1960, gambling is finally legalized. Remember how gambling was one of the great things that they went after when they were trying to make recreation rational in the early 19th century. The death penalty is finally abolished in 1965. Finally abolished in 1965. Of course, it continues in some other places. 1967, you have the decriminalization of abortion and homosexuality. And 1969, you have the big divorce reform laws, which basically makes divorce reform, makes divorce much more accessible. And the numbers of divorces rose quite dramatically immediately afterwards. In 1968, they were just short of 46,000 divorces happening that year. By 1971, there were just 74,500 divorces. So the numbers of divorces almost grew by 30,000 in the space of 3 years. And my parents were one of the first generation to take advantage of that reform. But it wasn't just that people were no longer getting married in church or getting baptized, or that all of these seemingly permissive reforms were coming in. There also seemed to be a fundamental moral crisis in the country. And in many ways, 1963 is a great year for this, because it's the year when the Lady Chatterley obscenity trial is held, and the year of the famous Profumo affair. So let me unpack both of those things. Do we all know about D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover? Yeah? Does anyone know? Do you want to explain to everyone what the book's about, very briefly? Anyone do a quick summary of Lady Chatterley's Lover? Herb? Buff, I think, is the expression. Buff, I think, is the expression that young people use these days. Yeah. A fine plot summary, actually, Herb. That's great. No, that works very well. The key thing is actually less the decorations than the fact that this is a cross-class relationship. This is a posh lady who falls in love with a gamekeeper or a gardener, and in the early 20th century we're talking about. And it's a sexually very explicit novel for the times. Okay, so it had been banned under the obscenity laws since its publication in. Anyone know the year of its original publication? Around 1920, I think. Someone can Google that and tell me in a minute. It had been published in abbreviated parts with the naughty bits left out. Okay, but the Penguin publishers published the whole thing in 1963. There's an obscenity trial, and the chief prosecutor at that trial famously said, "It's the kind of book you wouldn't want your wife or your servants to read." Okay, and this showed basically how this became obviously a cause célèbre. This guy was completely out of touch with contemporary society. And the defense team used that statement very, very effectively. And of course, as you can see in this image, everybody wanted to read a copy of Lady Chatterley's Lover. The Profumo affair was one of the great sex scandals that surround conservative ministers. Profumo was the Secretary of State for War. He had an affair with a young girl, a cool girl called Christine Keeler, who had also had a relationship with a Russian spy, someone attached to the Soviet embassy. Not a good thing to do if you're part of the military the British military establishment. That was less important than the fact that he denied having an affair in the House of Commons. He lied to the House of Commons about this relationship and then finally admitted that he'd done it. Harold Macmillan basically resigned a few months later, about 5 months later, on the grounds of ill health. But for many people, this affair represented that the Conservative administration, which had been in power since 1951, remember, had become morally bankrupt. Yeah? No longer had the moral authority for government. So there's one index of sort of moral decay. The other was a series of very spectacular violent crime. Okay, violent crime. So the Great Train Robbery with Ronnie Biggs in 1963, the Moors murders, which was a big serial murder case up on the Yorkshire Moors in the wonderful year of 1965, and then the trial of the Kray brothers, the East End gangsters, in 1969. And basically, since